Good evening and welcome to the Institute of Politics Fast Forum. My name is Mark Guerin. I'm the director, and we warmly welcome you and thank you so much for joining us. This summer, the Institute of Politics is working with our students really across the globe, providing opportunities like tonight and others to address the important issues of our day, and certainly giving the enormity of the moment and the impact these issues on our community. We want to provide space like tonight, other opportunities for reflection and healing and connection and action. So we thank you for joining us. In a special way, I thank our student leadership team, our exec team, for their work with us and for their creativity and their enormous dedication to the Institute of Politics. And I'm also very grateful to Mayor Melvin Carter, who joins us this evening. He has been a friend to the Institute of Politics, has been to the IOP. He has hosted directors, interns in his office, for which we're grateful. And his model of public service as a group of young, dynamic, innovative mayors who's bringing real and important change to his city is a model of public service that the Institute of Politics looks to with appreciation, certainly, and with admiration. So Mayor Carter, in advance, thank you for all that you do. Our student moderators this evening are the co-chairs of our Politics of Race and Ethnicity program, Busola and Jacob, who will introduce themselves, and then the mayor. But in advance of that, I want to thank them as well. They compiled very important educational resources and action steps for what we can all do to learn more, to read more, to think of action steps to confront racism in our country. So in advance of my welcoming them to the program, I thank them for their leadership and their commitment to our program, to our pre-program, and the important resources they provided. So Busola and Jacob, thank you, and I'll kick it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Busola Banjoh. I'm the current co-chair of Politics, Race, and Ethnicity program, zooming in from Georgia.
And hi, I'm Jacob Blair. I am the other co-chair for the Politics of Race and Ethnicity program, and I'm zooming in from St. Louis, Missouri.
We will begin tonight's conversation with 2 opening questions and then turn it to our fellow students. Please use the raise your hand function to indicate you have a question.
And keeping the amount of time we have in mind, we'll now turn it right over to our guest, Mayor Carter. He is a 4th generation resident of St. Paul, Minnesota. He served as a St. Paul City Council member from 2008 to 2013. And then in 2017, he was elected as the 46th mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. So please all join me in welcoming Mayor Melvin Carter. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you much. I'm happy to be here with you guys. I'm a big fan of the Institute.
Thank you so much. So I'll start off with the first question. So as emphasis on systemic racism has become a critical lens everyone has been recently talking about, I wanted to focus my question on racial health disparities, more so with health disparities impacting Black communities and communities of color with COVID-19. We know that Black and Brown communities in America have been hit the hardest with COVID-19, yet there seems to be an erasure of systemic factors like environmental racism, inability to be able to not go to work due to financial barriers, and living conditions with neighborhoods, cities, or conditions that do not allow for social distancing. As leader of your city, looking forward, how do you plan to address these factors that lead to healthcare disparities and impact Black communities and communities of color the worst?
Boy, Salah, that's an incredible question. It's so important because as we talk about this COVID-19 crisis and the fact that it's impacting our communities of color so profoundly, as we talk about, social distancing, as we talk about all of these things, and even just staying at home, we haven't, I think, had nearly the required discourse about the extent to which all of those things require a level of privilege that too often our Black and Brown communities just plain lack. If I can stay home and if I'm not an hourly worker, or if I have sick time, and I have insurance and all those types of things, maybe I can afford to stay home and social distance, but otherwise I still need to pay for my, groceries for my children. I need to pay the rent and things like that. And so one of the things that and it's an enormous question that I don't know that I'll be able to answer the whole thing in any one kind of response like this. But I'll tell you, as one of the things that we've really focused on is trying to sort of not just manage the status quo, but help people kind of invest in the types of things that can help communities lift themselves. And so we've raised the minimum wage in St. Paul. We've established new housing programs, new housing supports for low-income families in St. Paul. I'll tell you one of them that I'm really proud of is we created a program with our public schools to provide $300 a month for a set of low-income families to just help them pay the rent, with the notion that those families will stay stably housed, those children can stay in the same schools, and hopefully we'll see some significant educational outcomes as not only those children's education gets interrupted when they switch schools multiple times per school year, but all of the students in those classrooms have their education interrupted as well. So a lot of this centers around what we call our Office of Financial Empowerment, which we created in my first year in office to just say, you know what, we have people in our community, essentially kind of two kinds of folks in our community. We have folks who money is working for them, even in the context of these last few months when 40 million plus Americans have been laid off. We've seen the stock market rally. And so, you know, there's folks who money is working for them and they have the tools, the knowledge and the privilege to make money work for them. And then we have folks who, you know, see money working against them constantly, who, in the words of one of my mentors, always has too much month left at the end of their money. And so, you know, we have endeavored to say, what would it look like as a community to raise our collective credit scores? What would it look like as a community to make sure that our lowest income residents know that they can access earned income tax credits, for example, and to just partner with our community in a new kind of way to, like I said, help make their money work for them in ways that can help us build for the future, build assets, and build some generational something that we can pass on to our children. It's core in our definition of equity that we work with. I went to business school for undergrad, and you know, sometimes in our social justice spaces, we're not sure what equity means. In business school, we're always sure. It's a money word that talks about ownership. It refers to decision-making power. And it refers to the ability to build transferable wealth. And so those are the things that we need to do. And those three goals, I think, need to be at the heart of everything that we do if we're going to address the type of problems you just referred to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. My question is also related to the note of community that you touched on a lot throughout that answer. Because I think in your response to the murder of George Floyd, you've noted that the problems with police as they stand go beyond just one bad apple. And instead, you've argued that we're dealing with a deep-seated issue of cultural abuse and misuse of power. But you still argue that police are a necessary force in modern society and that they should be used as a proactive measure to deter crime. How do you reconcile your argument that police are a requisite force with the understanding that the issue with policing is deeply ingrained in our society? And how has your experience with police officers played into your view on policing?
The argument that I've made has actually been that that this public safety framework that we've historically had in America, that public safety is as simple as police, prisons, and prosecutors, has just been a failed experiment. The United States, we have 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's prison population. Our imprisonment rates are significantly higher than any other country on the planet, including, you know, way higher than some of the, you know, regimes that we, look at as totalitarian type of regimes. And, you know, that doesn't even, you know, if you break that apart, our imprisonment rates for, in particular, African American and Hispanic Americans are 6 times and 3 times, respectively, higher than our white counterparts. We have far over relied on imprisonment. We've far over relied on law enforcement, and we far over relied on these tools that, if you kind of go beneath the surface, we have in our entire public safety infrastructure. None of it kicks in until after a crime has been committed. That seems somewhat insane to me. And so what that does is, one, it leaves our communities in cycles of insecurity and violence as people act out in desperation. 2, it creates the wedge that I believe that's actually what creates the wedge between our officers and our communities. And it creates a significant amount it creates an enforcement bias, I would say, where, as a young African-American male, I knew that I wasn't getting away with anything because someone was literally always watching me. I got pulled over so much in high school that some of my friends used to call me hot potato, the children's game hot potato, where you grab something and then you try to let go of it. My father was a retired St. Paul police officer, so they would run my plates and find out that the car belonged to an internal affairs inspector, and therein they'd try to let me go as fast as they could. And so, and moreover, it creates, I think, a sense of resentment against our police officers, as we know that we can afford to spend $100 billion on policing every year. We in our country can afford to spend another $80 billion on prisons, but we can't afford to clear the Section 8 waiting list. We can't afford to help families with this crippling cost of childcare. We can't even afford to raise the minimum wage, so families who work full time aren't stuck living in poverty. We have raised the minimum wage in St. Paul, by the way. And so I think that setup messes us all up. I think it messes up our communities. It sets our police officers up for failure, and it perpetuates some of the negative cycles that we're working against. And so in St. Paul, we've actually already begun. People are asking me, what are you going to do now that this happened? And I always tell them, we're already doing it. We, in the first 100 days of my administration, we completely rewrote our use of force policies to include all of the things that folks are calling for online today. We completely rewrote the engagement policies around our canine unit to ensure that we, minimize our opportunities for mistakes there, because those mistakes in our canine unit can be pretty devastating. And we have already started. I think we're one of the first cities in the nation to embed social workers right in police cars, responding with officers to individuals in crisis. And we just last year piloted a program to replace criminal prosecution with restorative justice circles for nonviolent offenders. And so, our goal is to demonstrate new models of problem solving. Our goal is to connect people to opportunity. And then the last thing I'll say is last year, we had an unusual spike in shots fired. We had more shots fired in St. Paul last year than probably the last 20 years before that. And in response to that, we created my administration. I pulled my team together, and we worked with community members to create a $1.7 million public safety initiative that combined with a bunch of other investments that we were able to score from other sources, added up to about a $3 million public safety investment. And the irony of this moment right now is that you go back to October, November, December, and the major controversy in St. Paul, Minnesota was that we had a mayor who was simultaneously, in the face of a public safety challenge, reducing our authorized sworn strength of our police department, while putting $1.7 million into a public safety investment that focused on youth jobs, that focused on resources for young people, that focused on mental health supports, that focused on hiring neighbors to serve as kind of interveners and interrupters of violence, and did not hire a single additional police officer. So that was the controversy that we had last year. Ironically, some folks who, I think there's something of a shift in how people viewed that last year versus how they see it today. And so that's the vision that we have driven here in St. Paul, and that's the direction that we're going to continue to drive.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move to our first question. Amal Abdi, a director's intern in your office last summer.
Amal, what's up?
Hi, Mayor Carter. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. And just for the record, she didn't do an internship in my office. She blew up an internship in my office. She totally represented y'all real well.
Thanks. Thanks. It was a lot of fun. Definitely shaped my post-grad plans. And it's really great to be talking to you, just because I know from the time that I've spent with you that you really care a lot about local government and how it really impacts people most directly, more so than any other level of government. And I remember that you really cared a lot about involving the community in sort of forming the St. Paul budget, really reaching out to constituents to receive their input. And I can't help but asked you about what's happening in your neighbor city, Minneapolis, with Jacob Fry, and sort of calls to abolish the police department. There doesn't seem to be that kind of support for that among the St. Paul City Council members. But I'm really wondering about your thoughts on defunding the police greatly, whether we can expect sort of concrete changes in St. Paul, because I really liked all the things you mentioned about changing sort of how we view public safety, but I still have questions about how we can possibly change the culture of police and sort of their blind support of their other officers. And that doesn't really seem to be possible without greatly defunding them. So I hope, I just said a lot of words. I hope that was clear.
It is clear, Ma. I think we have a culture of policing, right? And this is not a controversial, or it might be a controversial statement, but it's not, I don't think it's all that bold to say. We have a culture of policing, a historic culture of policing in our country, which is violent, which is abusive, which too often doesn't play to the benefit of people like me. We have a culture of policing that I think bifurcates us into a protected class and a suspected class. And even as the son of a police officer, as I think Jacob mentioned, I grew up in the suspected class. And so I would get, pulled over all the time, like I just mentioned, and kind of all of those types of things. And so you're right. We have to change that culture. We have to address that culture. We have to do it impatiently. We can't do it incrementally, as we've tried. The royal we have already tried. That's not going to work, and it's not acceptable to do that. We see sort of the guardians of those cultures, unfortunately, in the police unions. To me, the whole purpose of the labor union movement has been to protect people like George Floyd, and it's a intense perversion of what unions are for. To see those organizations trying to protect these officers' right or privilege to unjustly murder George Floyd or Eric Garner, or whoever the video is that we're watching, each year and each month, it feels like sometimes. And so I do think that there's a number of things that we can do to intentionally kind of break that culture. I think it starts with hiring. It starts with how we hire. People always talk about training officers. I believe that if you have to train an officer not to do what those officers did to George Floyd, if you have to train an officer not to shoot Philando Castile as he's sitting in the car peacefully with his 4-year-old daughter sitting there, then that person never belongs with a badge in the first place. And so I think it starts with how we train, who we train. My father, like I've discussed, is a retired St. Paul police officer who worked in the same neighborhood that he grew up in, that he was raising his children in, that he went to the grocery store and the library in. And there's a level of accountability that provides that I think cannot be created otherwise. When you know that the young people you're engaging with know your children, you're going to be respectful, and you're going to hold yourself up to a standard that's probably higher than anything we can write into our policies. That said, it's about who we hire. It's about how we craft those policies. In St. Paul, our policies do all the stuff that you've, I'm sure, read about in the 8 Can't Wait campaign. But even more so than that, our policies go, as the national discourse is around reasonable force, our policies require that officers use the minimal amount of force that's both reasonable and necessary. So in St. Paul, to be in line with our policies, you can't just argue that this was reasonable. You have to prove that it was necessary, the amount of force that you use in a situation. And the other thing that it does that I think is really important is it differentiates between, the policy is named officer response to resistance and aggression. So it differentiates between how we respond to someone who just didn't stand up when we said stand up, or didn't move when we said move, and someone who is being aggressive towards someone else or towards an officer, which I think is important. So it's about who we hire, it's about how we set those policies, and then it's about how we hold those officers accountable. We see chiefs across the country who fire officers only to see them come back to their department through arbitration processes. So we have to be able to hold those officers accountable. They have to know that we're really serious. They have to know that they'll be fired. And we have to figure out through all these legal processes how to make it stick when we fire them. We just actually had this happen just last summer, I guess. Our chief announced the firing of 5 officers who were present when something illegal was happening, and they failed to intervene. They weren't the ones who harmed the individual, but they failed to intervene, and it seems somewhat intentionally decided not to intervene when someone was being hurt, and our chief fired them. They took us to court, and we were able to prevail in those lawsuits, which I think sends a strong signal both to the officers and to our community members that we're just not going to accept officers whose behavior willfully falls below our standards in our community.
Thank you again. Now we have a question from Ryan Sears, who is a JFK Junior Forum Committee member.
Hi there, Mayor Carter. I don't think you can see me too well because I'm behind.
I can see your trees well.
Well, that's fine. Well, thank you for coming, Mayor Carter. I read a comment that you made about your daughter saying that she didn't think anybody should be surprised over what's happened in the past week. And that's a heartbreaking statement, but I think a lot of us have felt similar feelings, those of us who are part of Black communities. And so I was wondering sort of what conversations have you been having with her? And then alternatively, on a more policy side, in terms of this engaging debate that's coming out regarding police unions and the outsized force that police unions have in negotiating processes, and also in systems of justice and whether police officers are adequately punished. And I think research has come out in certain localities that have indicated that there's some degree of association between collective bargaining agreements and police killings in certain neighborhoods or certain localities. And so I'm curious where you stand in that debate regarding collective bargaining agreements and police unions and whatnot. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a short answer. The truth is, I don't have a relationship with our police union here. You can look it up if you're bored one day. You know, they issued what many people in our community received as a pretty racist attack against me in the final days of my campaign for mayor. And unfortunately, while we have a set of officers who, by and large, I really stand behind, who I frankly think that given in the face of all the protests and demonstrations that we saw in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and I make a distinction between protests, the peaceful protests, and the riotous behavior that some folks, just came out to, bust windows and start fires. But our officers, I think, served us pretty well with regard to protecting the rights of people to peacefully protest, protecting the rights of people to gather outside the Capitol or to march on our freeway or march on our main streets. And I was out at some of those protests and appreciated the way they worked together with our organizers in a meaningful way, while frankly, while ensuring that we're protecting, people's livelihoods as well, and protecting our immigrants-owned businesses, our generational-owned, family-owned restaurants, our African-American-owned barbershops from being, looted and burned and rioted. That they did pretty well. I've seen lots of videos from around Minnesota and from around the country that are problematic to me about how we policed and how policing has happened in the last couple of weeks. And knock on wood, I haven't yet seen one that included an officer in one of our uniforms. And so I want to acknowledge that I appreciate that. At the same time, we have these unions who seem to just who've done, I think, a very effective job over the past decades, getting policy and getting legislation written in city halls and in state capitals across the country. They've done a very good job of inserting language into police union contracts that effectively shield officers. They exist as sort of a force field around officers that almost no matter what they do, they can get away with it. And I'm one who, over the past decade or so, as we've watched video after video after video play out, you go, goodness gracious, how egregious does it have to be in order for somebody to be held accountable for the taking of a Black life? And, after Philando Castile was killed, it was like, okay, maybe that's enough, right? Philando's important because he's from St. Paul. Philando Castile graduated from my high school, a year before my younger sister from Amal's high school, a year before my younger sister. And so, you know, that was, and he also, the school that he worked at was a school that my daughters, bringing them in, went to kindergarten at. And so while the world kind of chanted his name and hashtagged his name and, you know, dealt with this geopolitical thing, we were in St. Paul trying to explain to our children, like, what happened to Mr. Phil, which really, really sucked. So, yeah, so I had a conversation with my 12-year-old daughter, and she was explaining to me that she couldn't figure out why people were so surprised that people had been so angry about this. And that was heartbreaking, but I couldn't tell her why it should be a surprise. The great thing is, and I don't know if you guys have seen me, I've been all over the news talking about this concept called peace, but not patience, that we've been asking people to protest peacefully in ways that don't destroy our communities, but that lift us up and build and create a future where my children don't have to deal with this. And, you know, so she and I had a conversation about peace, but not patience one night. And she was talking about just how angry she was and just how much rage she had. And we had this conversation about like channeling that energy into something constructive. And Ryan, I kid you not, the next morning I woke up and came to the kitchen table, and she was sitting there drafting opening statement for the prosecution against the 4 officers, which I had something in my eye after that for a little while.
Thank you so much. So we have time for one last question from Zolberger, a HKS student.
Hi there, Mayor Carter. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening. So I'm currently a graduate student at HKS, and I'm also working this summer for the city of Chicago in the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And I've been really, interested in thinking more, especially in light of the last kind of 10 days, with the work that needs to happen outside of kind of concrete reform and legislation, actually on the ground in communities across, different racial groups and also across community members and city government, kind of what I think of as the heart and the mind. How do we acknowledge racist histories, racist structures, and actually kind of build the relational foundation for a path towards justice? So I would love to hear from your perspective what you think cities can do to try and help lift up and expand that work. It sounds like the restorative justice circles that you mentioned might be one piece of that, but there may be other opportunities too.
Thanks for the question. I actually think there's no shortage of things that cities can do, which is helpful because, as unfortunately we've seen our federal government do less and less and less every year, it feels. And as we see kind of these, reckless threats coming from the White House, mayors across the country are finding they're just having to step into roles that they haven't necessarily historically had to. And so I think there's an enormous amount of work that you can do at the local level, to sort of like, ease some of this tension. I think it's long-term work. It's stuff. Our police chief always talks about sort of the bank of trust that he talks about. And it's like, once you have to make a withdrawal, it's too late to make, the last 3 years worth of deposits. And so, that's been our goal. Our St. Paul Police Department, I think is it's certainly not perfect. And, you can, Google, I think I pull no punches. I'm pretty well known as I pull no punches when I think that they could have done something better. But that said, I think they in all in all, I think recognize the need to make those deposits in the bank of trust. We went viral a couple of years ago, my first year in office, because we had some officers show up on a loud noise complaint and ended up playing a video game, Super Smash Bros, with a group of young guys. So they showed up to kind of to respond to this call on. And so we have, I think, things like that. They add up. And the challenge is that George Floyd, wasn't killed in St. Paul. He wasn't killed by any of our officers. It didn't happen by our jurisdiction or our department. But when that happens, all of our departments around the country, no matter where it happens, it sets us all back, And so you have to, I think in a lot of ways, it's the same as any relationship with your friends or, my spouse or whoever it is. You have to constantly be building that relationship, and you have to know that the trust that takes a lifetime to build can be destroyed literally in the snap of a finger. And so this is where, again, I think it goes back to, really ultimately 2 things. One is the police accountability, to know that we have the policies in place, we have the accountability structures in place that when something happens, that we all can say, you know what, that falls way below our standards. That's unacceptable. That we can follow up, that we can hold those officers accountable. If necessary, we can get them off of our police force so that they're not able to perpetuate that again against somebody else. You know, zoom that out beyond cities. We also need the kind of federal databases and things like that, so they can't just go to a different department and do the same stuff, as we've seen kind of play out around the country as well. But then the second piece is this like budgeting thing, right? And when, you know, for some of our departments, for some of our cities, the police is like half of the budget, right? And we provide very little in housing supports, for example, right? The police is half of our budget, and we provide very little by way of just kind of those kind of day-to-day supports that families need to be successful. It says something. It sends a really loud and clear message of where our values lie, and it creates this kind of policing paradigm that doesn't really set out to protect all of us. It sets out to kind of like draw a circle and protect the people on the inside from the people on the outside, like enforce keeping the people on the outside out. And that's what I think is at the core of a lot of the resentment that we hear today. And so changing that paradigm, I think, is important. That's why we've been so intentional about investing in some of those just neighborhood level, child level, family level, worker level investments that can help kind of set us up for a better future. At the core, and I know we're out of time, but at the core, you know, I think about George Floyd, right? Who for 8 minutes and 46 seconds laid in the street with a knee on his neck. And he was stuck in a tragic paradox, which is that, you know, I watched that video and I see him not fighting. I see him not struggling. I see him not, you know, fighting to get up or fighting for that last breath. And the horrible paradox is, had he fought for that last breath, that struggle would have been what those police unions were using right now to justify his extinction. And that's heartbreaking to me, because it says that he was as good as dead when the video started, because his choices were either lay there and be killed, or fight back and be killed because you were fighting back. And that hurts, but it's a telling example of how, when we don't do what Amal was talking about, when we don't engage people in our processes, when we don't build our processes to serve people and to serve community members, when we don't know what I was talking about at the beginning, this like definition of equity, that our community members are owners, that they're the decision makers, that this is about building for them, not for like the city. The city doesn't really exist. It's a collection of people, but it's about building for them. Then we can create public policies and systems that actually can be weaponized against the very people that we should be seeking to help.
Well, thank you, Mayor Carter. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you again for a very enlightening conversation. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming out. We're continuing to try to serve the Harvard community by having great conversations with great people like Mayor Carter, just so that we can all stay connected, stay informed on ways that we can actually make reforms moving forward. So thank you all.
Thank you for what you're doing.